There are studies that show that if you compare a locavore diet to a vegan diet that's not, local. Sorry, I still have a cough. I was sick last week. That if you compare that vegan is still better for the environment. That buying if you're going to buy local meat, you're still harming the environment more than if you were going to buy lettuce flown in from a different country. So there is that data that shows that the miles that food has traveled is not as big of a deal as people think, and that they need to be taking into account, other variables, and animal products are just, a really big cost to the environment. With that said, I don't think that vegans should sort of just dismiss the idea of local either. I do think it's an important thing to be focusing on, but perhaps not dogmatically, and asking ourselves what's the point of local, because I'm not even sure exactly, to be honest, what local means in terms of mileage. Is local, does that mean that it's something from the Bay Area? Does that mean that it's something from California for me? Is it, all of the United States? So I think that sometimes it's taken on as a bit of a dogmatic thing, where perhaps it's not necessarily the idea originally of local. So for me, the idea of local is important because it's not just about the number of miles, and it's certainly not about this sort of kind of this aesthetic idea of like, oh, I'm just, sometimes it's more of this folkloric idea of like, oh, it's local, but without thinking about what that means. Because if you're buying from, if I drive 5 hours, another farmer is just as worthy of, having his stuff bought from local farmers. So I do think that local is important, because ultimately the miles do count, but also because local, as in buying from actual local producers and not just Costco that's, it's marketing something as local, means that I'm participating less in the corporate food system. And I think that's a really important part of it. It's not just this direct cost of how many miles did that travel versus was it meat or versus was it plants, but what food system are you participating in? And I do think it's important to build up local food systems where food is not, produced in large monocultures and then sold to Cargill, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, the local thing is actually important, not only because of the direct impact, but the indirect impact of, are you building up this corporate food system, or are you sort of having a more direct exchange with the farmer, and your $5 really did go to the cabbage, and it didn't go to the packaging and to the marketing and to all of these things and to the lobbying. And but again, in terms of actual environmental costs, there is data that shows that ultimately a vegan diet, even if it's not local, is better for the environment than a local diet. And I think it's a false dichotomy at the end of the day. Like, we should be taking the lessons from locavores and from, local food movement, from the local food movement, and applying those lessons within a context that also doesn't use animals. And so that would mean building up organic farmers, helping farmers transition to veganics, people who are new to gardening and farming, like helping them do it in a veganic way already. And so I think for me, that would be the goal, that we would build up local food systems, but doing it without the animal component. And so for me, that has been more of an ethical perspective. But it is also the logical result of an environmental concern as well. Because if we're buying local and we're building up local food systems to, first of all, participate less in the corporate food system, we shouldn't be buying byproducts from the corporate food system. And so some veganic farmers have come to it more from that perspective of really wanting to be as independent as possible and grow as many calories as much as possible with the amount of land that they have. And so that led them to just growing plants, because if you have 2 acres and you have a goat, you're going to be getting, yes, you can use, the manure, and yes, they fulfill certain functions. Sure, that's true. But if you use that space just for plants, you're going to be getting more plants,
Right. Yeah.
more food, more calories. So I actually wanted to show this book. Let me see if it, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a veganic gardening. I mean, he kind of talks about, is he a gardener, is he a farmer? It's not always clear what the distinction is. But this is a really good book from a veganic gardener who, you know, just goes into how to grow so many things, how to be very, very, very efficient with one's land. What's one of the things that's great about this book is that often the local food thing, and that's why I say it's often sort of more of an aesthetic, kind of a dogmatic thing of like, I'm going to go to the farmer's market and participate in this thing. And the reason I say that is because often it's focused on like fruits and vegetables, milk, those things. But really the basics of what we're eating is the pasta and the rice. And those are really problematic products. You know, those are the things that are really causing a lot of problems. Politically, environmentally. And so, and not a lot of people are really thinking about how are we going to get our carbs locally? How are we going to get our fats, you know, locally? Not a lot of people are, you know, really transitioning from, you know, palm fat to local olive oil. So this book is really great because he does speak about growing grains, growing legumes. And I think that a serious sort of effort to create local food security would include that. So wait, where was I? Sorry. Kind of lost my train of thought. Yeah, so basically I think that the local ideal does make sense. We can build it in a veganic way. And I think that sometimes vegans are perhaps a little bit dismissive of that. And that's unfortunate because it's not just about the environment. It's about so much more than the environment. And so that's worthy. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. It's taking, you know, the beneficial aspects of all these things that people learn and they bring from different perspectives and different experiences, and we can collate them and put them together and end up growing new ideas from that that are even more beneficial. So taking the locavore thing and taking what we learn about environmental impact of food, and also like learning things about food sovereignty and what that entails and what that would include, and putting that into the big picture.
Yeah, I just, on the topic of like how, you know, what is local and how people sort of, it becomes these vague notions that I think are used to justify often eating meat or dairy without really looking into things. So you know, I've been a vegan for a long time and my diet is not very soy based, but I do consume some, you know, tofu, some soy milk. And I used to live in Switzerland. That's where I spent most of my life. And when that discourse really started around soy is terrible for the environment, I was living in Switzerland. And it was interesting to me because people, you know, even farmers and others would say, oh, you know, but people don't eat, but they eat soy. But criticism of soy sort of appropriated what vegans had been saying about meat destroying the rainforests. And then as a counter to that, sort of pro-meat advocates started saying, well, you know, soy is destroying the rainforest. And so sort of by extension, when you're buying tofu, you're buying the stuff from far away that's destroying the rainforest. And the idea was that meat is a local product. You know, when you're in Switzerland, I don't know if you've ever been there, but you just drive outside the city and you see cows everywhere. Like it's very much this rural reality, you know, very pastoral type of like, you know, exactly what people want to see of like the cow and the grass. And so the idea is like, well, meat is local and tofu isn't because tofu is destroying the rainforest. But when I would buy tofu there, most of the time I bought it from a brand that was made by a local Buddhist monastery. It was Buddhist monks who lived like 50 miles away who were making the tofu. So in that sense, it was local. And the soy was usually produced in France, and it was organic soy. So I would consider that to be pretty local to Switzerland. So again, how many miles really is local? But I would have considered that to be local. It was a few hours away in a different country, but fairly close by. On the other hand, what is often not noticed is that even if the animals are local, often the feed that they're consuming is not local, and that's being, shipped in from Brazil. And so in the case of soy, that's the truth. The soy that is destroying the rainforests in Brazil, Paraguay, is not to produce tofu. Like, there aren't so many vegans eating tofu. That's soy that's going for cattle feed. And so in San Francisco, this sort of vague notion of local and, it's better and it's more natural, we see that in coffee shops, because the hip coffee shops in San Francisco, there are several of them, they in the last few years have stopped offering soy milk. So you can't get soy milk, but you can get local organic milk. And the environmental costs of the local organic milk are much higher than the soy, and the soy would probably not be soy from Brazil. Most soy milk in the US is from soybeans that are actually grown in the US.
Yeah, it is interesting. Like, if people really want to look into the issue, and there's a lot that we don't see, and then we just use a word and we take it for granted that it's a good thing without actually delving more deeply into it.